Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome. And it is my absolute pleasure to invite you all to the post-talk discussion session that we have for our monthly colloquium series on the Inference Project. So as you all know, yesterday we had a wonderful talk by Professor Jim Weatherall of University of California, Irvine. And the title of his talk was, "Why Do Groups Polarize Over Matters of Fact? What Models Can and Cannot Tell Us?" We started with, he started with telling us about these four different approaches, and he outlined the limits and the advantages of each of these modeling approaches to look at highly polarized groups of people. And this kind of agent modeling, he gave us a sort of an introduction to some of these agent modeling techniques, which scholars in the social sciences have often used in lieu of the kinds of simulations that physicists, astronomers, and people in climate modeling and other fields use, sort of simple, sort of numerical models. So it's the new kinds of simulations that help us examine social behavior. So today, it is my pleasure to introduce our discussant, Professor Kevin Dorst, who is on the faculty at the Department of Philosophy at the University of Pittsburgh, where he is an assistant professor. And he received his PhD from MIT, spent a year as a junior research fellow at Magdalen College in Oxford before starting this position. And all of his research projects have centered around one kind of meta big question, which is, what should we think about how people think? And, typically psychology is a discipline that is used to answer this question. And psychology informs us that people's thinking, that, we are actually very irrational as people, unlike the premise in often a lot of economic modeling where we are supposed to make rational choices. But his work has shown that these sort of irrationalist interpretations of data are actually questionable, and they rely on very simple models of what rational people would think and do. So these two contrasts of modeling people as either rational or irrational. And his work has tried to bring much more philosophically sophisticated models of rationality to bear on the interpretation of these types of empirical results claimed, in order to help assess the degree of irrationality and how assess how irrational we really are. And so this is sort of his big picture view, and its connection to polarization in politics is something that he explores in his blog post, A Plea for Political Empathy. So I urge you all to go and take a look at it. And for an extended argument that polarization has its roots in rational causes, see the series Reasonably Polarized, Why Politics is More Rational Than You Think. So I urge you to go take a look at his blog feed, which is really, really exciting. And before we embark on today's discussion session, I just wanted to remind you about some of our ongoing projects for which we would love your input. And one of them is our Learning by Doing projects, these simple experiments that can be conducted by kids, supervised with parents or teachers at home. So please consider either adding to our roster of experiments or sending us videos of your kids performing these experiments. It's saying that our speaker in the Inference series for June will be Eric Winsberg. And before further ado, I also want to thank our benefactors, Barbara and Richard Franke, for their support of the Franke program, as well as many other activities at Yale. So Kevin, take it away, please.
Thanks so much for having me in the introduction. I was telling Jim before the talk, this is like ideal timing for me to work on some of these computational models too, and have a lot of big picture questions about what we're doing when we're doing them. So I was thinking this would be an opportunity, at least for me, to grill and learn from Jim a little bit, someone who's been doing this much longer than I have, and hopefully it'll be fruitful. I also realized while Priya was giving that very nice introduction that I found my first typo on the handout, which is that I forgot to change the title of this handout. And so you might have, with that introduction and with the title, you might think I'm going to be going on and on about rationality, and actually that wasn't my plan. We're going to talk about it a little bit, but maybe that'll come back. But anyway, so what I was thinking I would do just in like the opening comments, questions is just refresh everyone's memory on the three models that Jim talked us through last time: trust, conformity, and reporting practices, and the big picture upshot he was sketching from them, and then use that sort of upshot and sort of some of its pessimism that I think he rightfully introduced at the end as like a launching off point for like, well, to ask the question of what really we can and should be trying to do when we're using these sort of simple computational models to try to understand complex, sometimes intractable social phenomena. So I'm gonna, the handout I think is shared in the chat, but I'm also gonna share my screen just for people who don't have it or can't download it. We're gonna walk through the handout together. Nothing too surprising here, but just as an anchor for where, can everyone see that? Sharing the screen, I hope so.
Yeah, thanks.
Excellent. So starting with a summary of what we talked about yesterday. So Jim introduced three different models that lead to polarization from somewhat plausible causes. The first is trust dynamics. So we have a bunch of little agents on a network that have some lines of communication between each other. They have to decide which of two options to perform, option B or option A. Option A, they know its expected value. Option B, they're unsure of how good an option is. The standard example is, which treatment should I prescribe to my patients? Doctors might wonder. And if you're interested in some good example of this, Jim and Kaylin in their book, and I think also in the paper this is based on, give detailed case study of this what's called the Lyme Wars, a debate over whether chronic Lyme disease is basically is a thing, whether chronic Lyme disease, whether Lyme disease that has been treated with antibiotics can sometimes linger and therefore get further benefits from further antibiotic treatment. There's a interesting polarized scientific, arguably scientific community polarized on that question. And so in that case, you might think, well, some doctors are deciding whether do I prescribe antibiotics or something else for this patient who may or may not have chronic Lyme. And so that's the sort of case where this model is most at home. And the way this works is that they learn both from doing their own tests or actions. They take some options, A or B, and decide, learn how good they are and try to learn whether B is better. But they also learn from their neighbors. Their neighbors share information about how their own tests went. And the key twist is that how much they trust their neighbors depends on how close their neighbors' opinions are to their own. In particular, how confident their neighbors are that option B is better than option A is a proxy for how much they trust them. And if they trust them less, they'll update less or basically treat their information as less reliable than if they trust them more, if their credences are closer. And the upshot is basically that when trust diminishes rapidly enough, based on how far apart people's opinions are, we often get polarization. One group ends up pretty confident that A is better. They stop trusting the people who are using B. And since they're doing A, they don't learn anything else about how good B is. While another group ends up certain that B is better, or arbitrarily confident that B is better, because they keep on doing B and keep on eventually getting evidence that it's better. So that was the first trust dynamic model. And so we end up with a polarized group because basically the sides don't listen to each other anymore. The second model was a conformity-based model. So again, same structure. We got agents deciding which to do, A or B. They're on a network. They can learn from their neighbors that they share a link with on that network. But now instead of having variable trust based on the degrees of confidence, agents feel some pressure. You might think of this as a social pressure to conform to their neighbors, the people that they share links with, the people they get information from and can talk to, or maybe trust, depending on how we interpret those links. Those are the people that they get some extra utility or value from doing what those people are doing. If everyone in my social circle is a Lyme literate doctor, as they say, and prescribes antibiotics in response to symptoms of apparent chronic Lyme, then I feel pressure to do so myself. And so I might be inclined to do so even if I don't believe that chronic Lyme is susceptible to antibiotic treatment. And the basic result here is that often this doesn't lead to polarization, but when the network has a particular structure, in particular when it has a clique structure, it can lead to polarization. So clique structure is where you have these two or many different groups that are all sort of well interconnected, but they are loosely connected to another group. Sort of like that. Hopefully you remember how those look. And the idea is, well, sometimes when you have this sort of structure, you can have a clique of people that are all doing A. Right? So they're not learning about how good B is. And maybe there's one person on the edge of all these people are doing A. And there's one person on the edge who this clique does B. This person learns from seeing these people that B is actually better, but they don't switch their action because they feel pressure to conform to their group. And because they don't switch, then these people who don't have direct connections to this other group never learn that B is better. And so everyone still does A. So the idea is basically that sparse informational connections between cliques prevent the information suggesting that B is better from breaking into this part of the network. And so that's the way in which we get polarization in action, and also belief sometimes. Many of these people will believe that A is better, or at least they can. The third model then no longer had a network structure. It was based on reporting practices of media outlets and how those interact or might interact with people's response for information and tendency perhaps to confirm their beliefs. So the model, in this case, we sort of model journalists are observing the world, they're observing earthquakes, they're observing economic consequences, or what have you. So some regular news that they can report on that is in some sense representable on a numerical scale in terms of how severe or how good or bad they are. And they have different reporting practices. They have to select what to report, and they can use hyperbole, they can make things sound more extreme than they are. They can use extreme reporting, which is they only report on extreme events, one's very far from some expected or neutral baseline. Or they do fair reporting, where they sort of like both sides journalism, where they have, whenever they give airtime to a bit of information pointing one way, they also give airtime to a bit of information pointing the other. If we take those three different types of journalistic methods, and then we add that the agents watching them have confirmation bias of a particular form, then we can get polarization. So in particular, the model of confirmation bias is just that people sometimes ignore the reports of journalists, and how likely they are to ignore a report is proportional to how surprising they find that report. So they, at a given time, they have certain beliefs about basically how likely the event there, the economy is to be doing well or badly or whatever. And how likely they are to ignore a report just scales with how unlikely they prior thought the report would be. And the interesting result then is for certain types of reporting, in particular for I think what you might call bimodal reporting, where journalists basically report two different classes of bits of information, for and against, more or less. So I think that follows from either extreme or fair reporting or both. Jim could correct me on this. It's wrong. But basic idea is certain forms of reporting that leads to polarization because people tend to pay attention to the stuff that the cluster of information that agreed with them. And so those are three, just to refresh your memory on three different models of polarization. We saw all prima facie plausible mechanisms that could be operative and what's leading to real world polarization. And so where Jim ended his talk was sort of with the question, what should we make of the fact that we've got these competing models of polarization? And where he ended is a point that I think I agree quite a bit with, but I want to sort of launch off from that point. So he says, like, look, we shouldn't see these models really as in competition. What we should see them doing is as identifying different mechanisms which on their own may be sufficient for polarization, but can also work together to create polarization in any given community. And so plausibly what's going on is that all these mechanisms and many more of the sorts that other models and modelers have made are contributing to polarization. Once we realize that, that's important and sort of frustrating because it means that we can't look at the dynamics of any given model we have, even one we like quite a bit, and read off what will happen by changing bits of the model and say that, oh, therefore get policy interventions from there. So the nice example Jim gave was, look, you might look at the conformity model and think, look, well, the problem with polarization is that we don't have enough communication. And so if we just add more links, then the information will spread through the network and they won't be polarized anymore. Good idea if this is your model, but as soon as you add distrust into the model, like from the first model, more communication actually can lead to more polarization. There's some empirical confirmation of that sometimes when you pay people to look at disconfirming news sources, they end up more confident in their prior beliefs. So the upshot then is that, well, look, we have these, we should be very cautious basically in inferring either predictions or especially policy interventions, that the effects of those based on any of these models, and we should see them in some sense interacting in a complicated way. So I'm going to use that then, that seems totally right to me, and I want to use it as a launching off point for the question, like big picture question then, which is sort of, what is the role then, given in light of that complexity, what is the role of the simple computational models like these of a complex social phenomenon like polarization? So in particular, given two of Jim's observations, the first is that there are, of course, going to be many sufficient and interacting causes for that phenomenon, for polarization. So distrust or confirmation bias or conformity or other things. And Jim mentioned this in his talk yesterday. In order to like sort of fully understand the interaction effects of those, it seems like we would need to somehow try to combine and sort of weigh those different factors together into one sort of, I call it, grand unified model. But that seems pretty plausibly an intractable problem, or at least we don't know how to do that well. We know how to make simple models and analyze their dynamics. We don't know how to combine a bunch of simple models to make a realistic one. It seems pretty clear that as soon as you get one marginally realistic, it's either going to be, well, probably both going to be computationally intractable, but also just inscrutable in the sense that there'd be too many interacting factors. It's hard to know what's causing what. And so harder and harder to test. So on that sort of pessimistic reading, my question is, well, what should we be trying to do when we make a model like this, given those facts? And I don't think I have an answer. I think I have some ideas. I think we'll maybe raise some possibilities and ways in which I think they might or might not fit with what Jim's thinking, what the models he was talking about are doing, and see what he thinks about those possibilities, see if he has other things in mind, and so on. So first option, sort of standard modelers option, we're giving how possibly explanations, where what we're doing is basically saying how could it be that polarization arises? And what we want to do when we are constructing these simple computational models is delineate the maybe plausible ways that polarization can arise in communities that have various structures. Once we do that with enough different models, we'll have a sort of catalog, a catalog of sort of that allows us, at least in principle, to like assess the promise or risks of various policy interventions. So we can sort of appeal to a bunch of different models that say, well, under this model, here's what this policy would do. Under this model, here's what it would do, and so on. That seems good as a first pass, but the immediate problem, and this is something I think Jim surely agrees with, that there's just far too many. There's far too many how possibly models for how you could get polarization. Just to focus on confirmation bias, I think there's more than probably, I would think dozens. I think I came up with a list of half a dozen or more different models of confirmation bias and how it could work and how it could lead to polarization. And making different predictions about what sort of various interventions would do. So we need some further constraints than just that we're not going to successfully catalog all these things, at least until we find some way to do like a meta-analysis of models, which I don't know. Is that a thing? Oh, first question for Jim, is that a thing? I feel like, anyways, I want to learn about that. But, okay, so we need more constraints broadly, I think everyone will agree. And so then I think my other questions are basically, what should the constraints, what constraints should we use, or which constraints are useful to use? Option 2 here says, well, take the how possibly explanations, constrain them to rational models, which will be no surprise given the title that I accidentally put on this handout. So, one constraint we could give is, okay, can we show that polarization can or will arise under maybe even quite strong rationality assumptions? And that can be useful in part, at least in part, just because many explanations of polarization appeal to irrationality, so it can just push back against certain explanations or show that they're not necessary. And I do have some sympathy for that, but we probably need more constraints as well. It's one thought. But I'm not sure, question for Jim, is that how Jim wants to sort of constrain things? It sounded from the way he was defending some of the models that he was less happy to try to defend them as rational. I mean, the confirmation bias is pretty clearly not a rational model. Even the scientific polarization, the trust dynamics one, is maybe at best a first pass reasonable proxy to use distance from your belief as a measure of trust. But surely would be, if you put two people in a lab in front of slot machines and they actually follow those dynamics, you'd get pretty nutty results. You would think they were doing something silly. The conformity model, I don't know. The conformity model might actually do better on this front, so I want to hear what Jim thinks about that. But so that was one approach, is rationality as a constraint. Another constraint we can impose is sort of a psychological constraints, or class of constraints, psychological constraints. So sometimes psychologists are pretty confident about sort of what the specific reasoning mechanisms are that lead to polarization, at least in certain cases. So there's a good number of fairly robust, if always messy and contested empirical findings that say under conditions of this form, here's broadly what people do, and that leads them to confirm their belief. So confirmation bias is a bit of an umbrella term that fits a bunch of features that have this sort of structure. Positive test strategies, they ask questions that they expect yes answers to. Selective exposure, they look for information they expect to be confirming. Bias assimilation, when given mixed evidence, they interpret it in a way that fits their prior beliefs. Diagnosticity, they tend not to care about likelihoods, in effect, if you're a Bayesian. And so, I mean, that's contested, by the way. But all these are contested, by the way. But so there are a bunch of specific reasoning mechanisms which people arguably do, or at least sometimes do. And one role for a modeler then seems like it could be to like sort of check the experimenter's intuition that if they did this, it would lead to population level polarization. Sometimes just obvious, like sort of ignoring information that tells against your beliefs and listening to information that tells in favor. It's like pretty clear. I mean, we can check that, but it's pretty clear that's going to lead to polarization. Sometimes it's not obvious and wrong. So one of the well-known instances of confirmation bias is positive test strategy. People ask, in fact, questions they expect the answer to be yes to, given their preferred hypothesis. It's famous from some Wason selection tasks and so on. Turns out that doesn't lead to predictable polarization unless there's some other error along the way. As long as you know what question you ask, then there's no expected polarization. So that's something that modelers can show, and so that's one role modelers can play, sort of looking at the details of psychological mechanisms and seeing what their effects are population-wise, population level. So maybe that's the interpretation of at least what the confirmation bias model that Jim talked about is doing, but I'm not so sure, and maybe Jim can speak to this as well. So it seems to me that if we're going to do this sort of psychologically modeling, then it really is quite important that we do our best to match the details of the psychological mechanism in question, that we sort of, we have some particular psychological mechanism, we look at exactly how it works, and then see whether that leads to polarization. And I mean, I think the model of confirmation bias that they use, which is sort of being less likely to update information that you find more surprising, is maybe a good first pass, but definitely there are many more details of the empirical story. Like empirical story about how selective exposure to new evidence works. There are many moderators for it. Jess Wilson has this great dissertation on confirmation bias, which I take every chance to plug that I can. One just like simple thing to point out is that there's, insofar as there's a drive towards confirmation, there's also a drive towards looking at surprising things. That's well confirmed in a variety of other finding scenarios, including, for example, when people look at what causes fake news to spread. And if we model confirmation bias, then it's just being less likely to update on information that you find surprising, then that's at least in competition with those other mechanisms where surprisingness actually leads people be more likely to look at that information. So that's just to say, it does seem like there's a role for the computational models in sort of lifting up psychological reasoning mechanisms, seeing what they do at a population level if we apply them. But it's less clear to me that that's what some of these models at least are trying to do, certainly. Oh, I'm gonna ask about, I don't know about the conformity models. Maybe those are closer to so I'll ask what James could jump in on that as well. Okay, final concerns. I've gone on for a little bit too long here, but final thought for how we might try to further constrain the space of possible models is to impose further features on the sort of polarization where models we observe empirically as a constraint on what our models should allow us to predict. So one classic feature of polarization is just people who have different beliefs and stably so, right? But there are many other features of at least many instances of real world polarization which we might want to try to capture as well. So consider, a classic example of a polarized empirical question, whether capital punishment has a deterrent effect. In many of the psych studies that people find confirmation bias use this sort of question. Probably you have a decently strong opinion on that. Here are, I think, arguably, well, this could be questioned, but arguably 3 features of that strong belief you have about whether or not capital punishment has a deterrent effect. First, it's predictable, not merely in the sense that it's predictable that people will disagree about it, but it's predictable which side individuals will end up on. Often they can predict it too. Often, even if you're unopinionated on whether capital punishment has a deterrent effect, you can predict what your future belief will be. So just take a college student who's deciding between a super liberal urban college and a conservative rural college. They probably wouldn't think very much about this, but if they thought hard and they thought about it a little bit, I think they would pretty confidently predict that if I go to this liberal school, I can predict that I'm going to be on this side, the anti-capital punishment side of the debate. And if I go to this conservative school, vice versa. So that's a form of predictability which is much stronger than just predicting that there will be 2 different factions. It's predicting which direction a given individual will go. Often polarization, the second feature, is often profound. It's not merely that they're stable opposing beliefs, but they're basically arbitrarily confident in their beliefs. And that's possibly true of at least certain, maybe capital punishments, and that's hard enough empirical question that people are a little less confident. But anyway, so surely we could find others. Here's one that I think maybe is questionable, but I'm inclined to think is a feature as well, is that many of these polarizations are robust in the sense that people's confidence in their opinions remains upon learning good empirical stories about how those opinions came about. So probably most people in this room have read enough op-eds and maybe psych studies and whatever on how confirmation bias works, and maybe certainly if they came to Jim's talk, they have some idea of how these sort of models of polarization could look. They have some sense of what the social science looks like when it comes to explaining polarization. And I take it no one has changed their belief on whether capital punishment is a deterrent. No one's become less confident of that upon reading some op-ed in the New York Times about how confirmation bias works, or at least not significantly less confident. And so that's a constellation of further features that I think many polarizations have. And then question, do we have models which explain those features? And here's, I'm going to speculate a little bit, and this will be maybe a good place for Jim to come in as well. I'll end here as well. But I think that the confirmation bias model they give has A and B, but not C. So A, it's predictable which direction you're going to go. You just basically look at where your prior beliefs are and what media reporting practices are. Are they bimodal or not? It could be profound because you could, as Jim was showing, you get more and more confident in your beliefs. But I don't think it's going to be robust in the sense as soon as you tell people that, well, what you've been doing is just ignoring information from the other side, if they're minimally reasonable, they'll just immediately knock down the confidence in their beliefs quite a bit. I take it that's not what we do. Some debatable whether just because we're pig-headed, but we can come back to that. Conformity model, I think, has C, robustness, and so you know what the network structure is, and maybe even A as well. It's predictable. Like if you're in a clique that's all A doers, you're pretty confident you're going to end up an A doer, at least maybe also an A believer. I don't think it's profound in the sense that the reason why we get polarization is exactly that there's an information dam. So no more information is spread, so people just don't get any more confident in their beliefs. They just keep doing what they're doing. I think that's right. I may be wrong about that. So Jim, do correct me. And the trust model, it seems like, well, I mean, it might depend. I'm not actually sure about predictability. This is the question. If we start out, at time zero, and we look at the distribution of beliefs, can we predict who's going to end up really confident that B is better, and who's going to end up on the sort of, at least with not perfect accuracy, but some confidence? Not sure. So I'll do it randomly. So I don't know whether it's predictable, actually. It's profound in one sense. One side is arbitrarily confident. The other thinks that A is better, and they're, I think, in general, just like moderately confident. They don't get arbitrarily confident of that. And whether it's robust maybe is subtle, but at least if people know that what's going on is that everyone's just sharing information that they have, and they're just trusting people based on distance beliefs, then they would know that people are telling the truth, and so they would then update them on that information. And so it's not clear how robust it is to knowing the structure, knowing the cause. So that's my, basically not meant as a criticism per se as the models. I don't know if we really, there's a question whether you even could have a model that would meet all these criteria. And I think that's a subtle and interesting question as well. And so, but an attempt to maybe try to go from where we were at the beginning, which how possibly models are too unconstrained, to can we bring in more constraints to try to further control the space of where we want to go or where we want to look, and whether adding these sort of features of polarization or rationality or psychological constraints could help the choice of which models to investigate. So I'll stop there. I think I threw about 1,400 questions at Jim. Apologize for all those, but hopefully we can get some back and forth going about some of these things.
Thank you so much, Kevin. That was really a wonderful dissection with many clarifications as well as really important questions for Jim. So Jim, please go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much, Kevin, for putting together these thoughts. There's so much to think about here. I'm actually going to pull the handout over to be in front of me so that I can keep it as a guide here. I think there are a lot of things to say at sort of at different levels. So of the options that you mentioned, I think of this as somewhere between option 1 and option 3, with a further possibility for development that you don't mention. So there's some sense in which what we're doing here is how possibly modeling, because these are highly idealized. We aren't trying to capture the details of the psychological phenomena that we're sort of looking to for motivation or inspiration. In some cases, they aren't even psychological in the sort of folk sense of psychological. They're more like social psychological phenomena. There's seems to be some some tendency of people to behave in certain ways, and we don't know what the underlying psychological mechanisms are for that, but it's an observed behavior, and we can extract from that behavior some further information that could then be a starting point for modeling. But the models themselves are essentially how possibly. Cameron uses an expression, how plausibly sometimes. She has a paper where she draws a distinction between that. There's a kind of modeling where, like, what your goal is to show that something that someone said was impossible can happen. So I don't know if this example will help anyone, but there's a famous claim in the early 20th century, sort of late early 20th century, that language could never evolve because you can't evolve language without already having language. And one way of responding to that was a game theoretic and eventually evolutionary game theoretic analysis of how signaling systems can come into existence through a kind of dynamical process. And the claim isn't that this is how signaling systems actually evolved. It may have some qualitative features in common with how they actually evolved, but that's not the point. The point is someone said this was impossible. Here's a scenario in which you show it is possible. That establishes that it can happen. Now there's further question whether it did happen. And we're doing something that I like to think is a little bit more than that, because no one is going around saying polarization cannot occur. I mean, it seems quite clear empirically that it does occur. And so it's more like, let's try to understand whether the various kinds of hypothesized conditions that look like they might be relevant to polarization can be seen to actually bring about polarization, even in simple cases. And so that's kind of, this is what Kalin calls how plausibly modeling. It's not just for the pure sake of establishing possibility. But it's a similar kind of modeling strategy where you aren't trying to get anything approaching the full complexity of the system you're looking at. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, it would be great if we could just go back and forth along this. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. So is the thought there like the difference maybe between how possibly, well, at least a rule of thumb for the difference between how possibly versus how plausibly is like, has anyone sort of, well, in the how possibly you're just trying to come up with a mechanism and show that it could work. In the how plausibly, it's like people have posited these mechanisms and we want to verify that they actually do what people think they do. So it's something like I see what you mean by sort of like option 3, it's a psychological one, but it's not necessarily psychological in the sense of looking at the details of how individuals are reasoning or replicating that. It's rather looking at maybe a high level social psychological tendency and making sure that it really is the case that if, people only learn from their neighbors or whatever, people don't listen to people that have very different opinions than them, that you will get polarization reserving in the aggregate. That's the...
Yeah, that's exactly right. So that's the sense in which, we try to make the case, and for each of the sorts of mechanisms that we're looking at, that we are capturing some of the salient details that seem to be present in the real world cases that we're interested in. And we're asking, is that enough? And that can sometimes happen not at the level, just as you say, not at the level of sort of the details of actual reasoning, but rather at the level of what behaviors seem to result from the reasoning that does take place. And yeah, so I think as you say, there are lots of ways of modeling confirmation bias. There are lots of ways of modeling trust too. there are even lots of ways of modeling how people change their beliefs or opinions in light of, interaction with their neighbors. And I mean, I tend to think that even, Bayes' rule is not, I mean, no one's doing Bayesian calculations. I'm curious, actually. I mean, I know that different people have different. I think some people think that they are, but I'm inclined to think they probably aren't, or they don't need to be, at least, in order for it to be the case that strict conditionalization is a good way of modeling the kind of belief updating in light of new evidence that agents are doing. And so I would think of the other kinds of, so the kind of conformity calculation, right? We imagine our agents are performing an expected value calculation and then acting in a way that they believe will maximize their payoff in the next round. Are people actually doing that calculation? Is that actually what happens when people conform? Probably not. I mean, there's a kind of gut level decision being made, I would think, but it's also the case that there's a trade-off happening, and this captures that kind of trade-off. And you can ask, well,
some of the neuroscientists think that the gut level is exactly where all the Bayes calculation is coming from. It's all the expected values are like manifested as your gut is telling you. But I think we don't have to go that far to.
Yeah, well, so you don't need to anyway. I mean, something has to be happening on look, I mean, if nothing else, I mean, our agents have arbitrarily precise, they're floats. Okay, so they've got 64 digit precise credences, which I think is probably not perfectly accurate as a representation of human cognition, but I don't think that matters for what we're trying to do. And I think of the other kinds of idealizations here as similar, right? Trying to find something that seems to have the right kind of qualitative behaviors at the level that they would need to in order for them to sort of be playing the kind of social role that is being explored in the model. So that's it.
Maybe that one question I had didn't bring up, which is when in the confirmation bias model was, well, what form of confirmation bias are we doing? Is this sort of the ignoring information, or is this sort of being biased in how you interpret information? Am I right in thinking that you're thinking, brother, what does it really matter? Sort of either one is going to have some sort of effect which has information that doesn't fit my prior expectations is going to be more likely to play less of a big role in how I change my belief. So maybe it's because I look at it, but then I discount it in some way. That's the bias assimilation. Or maybe it's because I don't even look at it. And we can gloss over some of the psychological differences there and use this model to explore either one. Is that how you think of what the confirmation?
Exactly. And I'm suggesting, I mean, so there's another whole framework for modeling confirmation bias in the mathematical social sciences literature, where you model confirmation bias as just having extreme priors. And you get to then make confirmation bias a purely rational thing, capital R rational within a particular decision theoretic framework. But it doesn't involve, ignoring or reinterpreting or changing what data you're updating on. It involves just updating more slowly. We're avoiding, we're suggesting that doesn't actually have, although it's well entrenched as a modeling procedure, it doesn't seem to me that it adequately captures the salient feature of confirmation bias of several different types that we think is operative in this case, or at least may be operative in this case.
Yeah. That seems right to me. Yeah, it seems like it's not just a matter of extreme priors. What do you what's the criteria by which we're then objecting to that as a model? Because like, someone could then object as well to the sort of ignoring data model, which is that is a tendency people maybe have, but they also have this tendency to look at surprising things. And so like, how do we whenever we have a psychological tendency, there's going to be, because humans are complex and intractable, there's going to be 18 others that we could layer on, which may have, may reverse the effect.
Mm-hmm.
The
extent to which that's true.
Okay.
I mean, I think there are two things to say. One is that the extent to which that's true, right? That there are other equally plausible things that I could add on that would reverse the effect. I would see that as just a failure of stability of the model, and would make me much less confident in drawing any inferences at all from a model with that character. But of course, like we're in a particular epistemic position where we know some things, there's some things we worry about, some things we don't know about yet. We're trying to figure out how it works, and we're just partway through. And so, these models haven't been fully evaluated for stability. And one way in which you might try to rule out a particular mechanism as a plausible one you have to worry about is by showing that it's not stable under small perturbations that you think would make it more realistic.
Right. So I think I have a looming like, but we don't want to end up with a model that's intractable, so we can't keep on adding things. Is the strategy more piecemeal? So we have some model which captures this model of confirmation bias. And then there's the question, well, if you add like add interest in surprise, does that like counteract the effect? And we can we don't want to try to model the 18 psychological mechanisms that could interact with this, but we can take one and then try adding the second one and try adding the third one piecemeal and see whether they, so it's sort of like a pick from your slew of reasonable psychological mechanisms and try to pick as few as you can.
Yes, although the way that I think about it is a little bit different, just because, so I think of these models as being tools for reasoning, in the sense that you have some vague ideas about how things are going to relate to one another, how these sort of, psychological or social psychological phenomena that you've observed or that you read about in the literature, how they work and how you think they're going to work in a social setting. And now you try to extract from them some of the basic features that you think are the salient ones, and you set up a model in which you just have those sort of simple components and you see what happens. And then you get these results. Now you're trying to figure out what the results mean, why these outcomes happen, what's going on. You start playing with the model, and in playing with the model, you start getting a sense of how within the model interventions are changing things, which sort of gives you a sense of how the model's actually working, which then leads you to start thinking about how to interpret the results generally and how they bear on like the expectations you had originally. Are you surprised by some things, not surprised by some things? Is this exactly what you expected in the first place? And often in that process, you start thinking, oh, I see, in this model, we're getting this result for that reason. But that's not really what's going on in the real world. That looks like it might be an artifact. We should try to adjust the model in a way that removes that artifactual element and see if we get the same kinds of results. To what extent is the thing that I now am worried was driving the results but isn't really particularly realistic, like actually the thing that's driving the result. And so it's not just to come up with a new mechanism and add that to the model. It's more like in reasoning about how the model works, you learn something about the phenomenon in the first place, but also something about the model.
That seems convincing to me.
What's that?
That seems convincing to me. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a dialectic process that I think I think it's pretty common in science, but
I certainly had that where like I was expecting an effect in a model to push one way, and it turned out there was another effect I didn't see coming which pushed the other way, and then it's so that's why that can't. Yeah. Anyways.
Yeah.
So.
And I mean, I can give an example from a paper that Kaylin is working on with one of our PhD students right now, where they discovered that confirmation bias implemented in one way in a network epistemology model improved outcomes. And they were like, oh, like what's happened here? And it seemed to turn out that what it was doing was slowing down learning in a way that kept transient diversity in some network structures long enough for enough data to accumulate, which in retrospect makes perfect sense given the way these models often work, was not at all, as I understand it, what they expected. And now you have, there's sort of a judgment call on some level, like to what extent do we think that is really a possible role that confirmation bias can play in real world cases, and what would it take to establish that, and to what extent we think that this is just an artifact of the modeling framework.
Didn't Miriam Solomon write a paper arguing that? I don't know if I've read the paper, but something like that, like in the night, like that seems like a cool, I don't think it was a computational paper, but it was like.
That confirmation bias.
That had this effect of sort of, I think it was an example of plate tectonics. I don't remember the details. Anyways, that seems like
I don't think I know the paper. I think there's a book by two cognitive scientists that I think advances some version of this thesis. You probably know it, but yeah, exactly.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, I got a lot of questions on Mercier and Sperber, but we can. Oh, that's probably for another
time. They're really questions for Kaylin, not for me.
Yeah. Okay.
So there were a few other things here that I wanted to come back to here. So the rational model stuff. This is I think that understanding how polarization can arise under strong rationality assumptions is really interesting and important. All of the models that we're looking at are sort of low rationality models, bounded rationality models, or models where a strategy is adopted that's not even boundedly rational. It's intended to reproduce some apparently occurring phenomenon, not one where we have some background justification for why that kind of behavior would be rational, but one that seems to be happening. This is how I think about the trust dynamics. We don't, scientists don't read papers by people who they think do dumb stuff. So what's with that? Isn't this just part of the literature? Well, yeah, maybe a waste of your time, but maybe you just think that it's not going to be fruitful for other reasons, that, even if you had all the time in the world, that you wouldn't actually get reliable information from it. I think that, in cases like that, you probably can give a pretty nice full rational case where you have a theory of what the other person is doing, and you have some priors about how useful it's going to be, and maybe you do a cost-benefit analysis, or maybe it's that you think that this is all noise and no signal, and but we aren't trying to model all of that, and I think on some level it doesn't matter for us whether or not there's a story that you can tell in all cases that gives rise to that kind of outcome. Yeah, so I guess this is sort of a question back for you, which is, it sounded to me like if one were going to adopt option 2, you would need to believe that rationality wasn't just a normative framework, but it was a fully descriptive framework for human cognition and social interaction. Like, are you committed to that?
I certainly don't want to be, but I guess there's different projects you'd be trying to answer. One would be, there's a pure social epistemological question, which is like, do rational agents polarize? And like, you can be interested in that question independent of what you think about folks like us. Now, that's relevant insofar as like sometimes people will write arguments saying, well, look, people are polarized, and that must mean they're being idiots. And so, like, insofar as it blocks that inference, then it's an interesting normative fact to know. And insofar then as the mechanisms by which, insofar as then we both have that normative thing and then can connect it to various psychological theories and so on, then maybe the case can be made for...
Is it how possibly claim in the first sense that I discussed, right? That, yeah.
Yeah, I guess
So,
how possibly, right. Yeah.
Right. Before we shift theme, we have an interesting kind of relevant question from the audience. Sanjeev Kumar asks, do you think we might be better off focusing on the contextual features, in other words, the nature of constraints giving rise to polarization? Many of the preference-based approaches to learn about aggregate level features are based on intentional agents. And so they are making, I guess the point is that they're making a strong assumption about free will. Do you think confirmation bias emanates from a high risk preference? Now, that's an interesting take. Either of you want to take a shot at it? Go for it. Yeah.
There are some papers that argue under some forms of, I don't really understand these papers off the top of my head, but that argue some form of ambiguity aversion, uncertainty about how accurate your beliefs are going to be, something you can be averse to, and that can lead to something like confirmation bias. So that's something like a high risk preference. I don't, in some of, at least as far as I understand some of those models, it's a strange sort of ambiguity aversion insofar as if you're like, have confidence 50-50 in a question, then there is no ambiguity. You know exactly how inaccurate you're going to be. Whereas if your confidence 80%, you're not sure whether, because you know the distance between your degree of confidence and the truth is 0.5, whereas, or whatever your distance metric is, it's the same to either side, 0 or 1. Whereas when you're 0.8, it's potentially different. So you're unsure exactly what your distance is going to be, and layer on some level of, I think, a risk aversion / ambiguity aversion, and you get, surprisingly, you get some sort of confirmation bias. Now, that's another case where I think, like Jim said about the extreme priors case, I think that's an interesting theoretical result. Doesn't seem super plausible to me that that's what's driving confirmation bias for real. I think people, if anything, prefer to have extreme opinions rather than opinions around 0.5 with the chaos. So there are some subtleties there. I don't know if Jim has anything.
I mean, the main thing, I'm sort of focusing on the first part of the question of focusing on contextual features, like the nature of constraints, giving rise to polarization. It does seem to me that so this is something that came up a bit yesterday with a question that Priya asked, whether or not we can, we ever have a sense that one model of polarization might be better suited to some particular case than others. I think that the answer is probably yes. And I think that the right way of thinking about that is that you're focusing on contextual features and sort of some background understanding you have of how the particular issue is dealt with in the particular social group that you're talking about, what the nature of the issue is, what kind of evidence is available, how information seems to spread. And so I think that in particular cases, we can say a bit more, and sometimes even quite a lot more. On the other hand, that only helps a little bit for some of the bigger picture kinds of questions that we're interested in. And so as a purely practical matter, if what you're imagining is something like, well, suppose you have the view that at least some of the polarization that we've seen in the US and the UK, say, in the last 20 years has been driven by new technology.
Oh, you mean okay, polarization, you're talking about the response to, say, new technologies. Right.
So what I'm saying is like it's some combination of like the rise of certain kinds of cable news channels followed by the rise of social media has led to a feedback loop that has driven polarization.
Right.
You might even say something like, well, part of the problem here is intentional decisions made by social media companies to drive engagement on their site. So there's they're incentivized to maximize time spent and shares and things like that because that maximizes ad revenue. And so you want to promote highly emotional content or promote content that is surprising in a certain way, or content that's, you may not even have a theory of why. You have an algorithm that identifies what content seems to get the most interactions and the most shares, and you promote that more broadly. You might think, okay, well, that's actually driving polarization. Now you say, what kind of policy interventions, either as a social media company or as an oversight organization or as a government, do you want to introduce?
Right.
And at that level of description, the contextual factors don't matter because you aren't worried about polarization about vaccines or polarization about COVID or polarization about election results. You're worried about polarization writ large. And it looks like, in general, any or all of these considerations could matter.
Yeah. And I guess he has a follow-up question. If we use the framework of the approach avoid dilemma, then confirmation bias can come from avoidance behavior. Yeah, fair point. Yeah, I see that. But, I had a more kind of provocative question for you both. I mean, underlying all of these ways of thinking about polarization, isn't there the assumption that people are interested in the truth?
Yeah.
Might it be possible? I mean, and as a question that is separate from, if we don't conflate that with rationality, rational behavior, and so on. I mean, what if we were to lose that premise, that sort of prior? Maybe there are people who are not interested in the truth value. I know that takes us nowhere in terms of modeling, but I was just curious, right? It seems like, for example, you often watch, this is one of my pet examples. And so, you watch, suppose you go to YouTube and you say, I want to watch the latest SpaceX satellite launch that I missed. You go and look at it, right? And then, other things that you might like, right, along there is a Flat Earth Society link that shows up, right? And that, as you just mentioned, Jim, and both of you address these questions, like, social media, et cetera, leverage. So it's like, other related things that you might, these are not assessed for truth value or anything. It just shows up there. And so now this Flat Earth Societyers, their link has the same salience in the rank choice search method that Google is using, right? So that it's asking you. So, and how can somebody, I mean, unless you are not interested in the truth and you're just looking for an excuse to join some kind of affinity group of people who, people who like the color red, people who believe in the flat earth or whatever, right? I put all of those it's that kind of, how do we take that into account? And that, is there any way we can model that? Or is that throw our hands and give up?
I mean, well, I'm sure Jim has stuff to say too. I feel like it's a great question and a somewhat complicated one. I think it's definitely right that people have many motivations that govern what they see and how they think, that aren't just figure things out. That you're on YouTube. If you're on YouTube, you're probably not like in your peak epistemic and peak inquiry mode. You're probably like at best sort of having a informative pastime, whatever. So that's totally right. I think as far as my read on the psychological literature on motivated reasoning and motivated cognition and related phenomena is that it's rarely so simple as that people don't care at all about the truth. It's rather that they have other things and then they somehow those can push them to use information that can convince them of various things in certain ways. So, I'm thinking of, I think you mentioned in the last session some work by Dan Gahan as well, which shows that often more polarized people on a given topic are the ones that on various measures are more cognitively reflective or more scientifically literate. They know more about an issue, and they are able then to rebut problems with, or rebut standard features. And I think, as far as I know, the same thing is true in general of conspiracy theorists, that like anti-vaxxers or truthers about 9/11 or whatever are people who in general know a lot more than I do about sort of vaccine distribution and production processes and about what happened on days leading up to September 11th and that sort of thing. And so in general, I think certainly there's room to point to non-truthy motivations, and that I think that's like some motivation for thinking about Jim's models where people care to conform, that sort of thing, or other. I think those actually might fit quite well with some of Kahn's research. But I think it's too easy. We make it too easy on ourselves as the modelers if we just think that can be thought of as this person doesn't have any concern for the truth. Rather, it's filtered in all sorts of subtle ways.
I mean, there's a sense in which this is using a certain kind of decision theoretic framework to describe what people do. But there's a sense in which, so for instance, in the model that uses conformity that Kevin just mentioned, they care about some truth. They care about what payoff they're going to get. And their payoff is a combination of payoff due to their true or false beliefs. Their true or false beliefs about, she's also about to go give a talk. So I think.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. Their true or false beliefs about the proposition at hand, which is going to have some lead to some actions and have some payoff, but also their true or false beliefs about conformity, because I get a payoff from that as well. And in some sense, the way that I tend to think about it is like people are motivated by something, and they care about whether or not the actions that they take bring about the outcomes that they want. Now, they may not be able to articulate what outcomes they want. The outcomes that they want may not match up in the way that others as outside observers would think of as sort of characterizing the outcome space. But there's some feedback from the world to any decision that you make. And if you're just totally wrong about what that feedback is going to be, I guess some people are unhappy, but I mean, it's not going to work out for you.
Right. No, but I mean, I like I like, I kind of understand and I get what you're saying, both of you, that, that it's not like super useful to think about people being polarized as some people not being invested in the truth at all, because it really, I mean, they're invested in the truth, but modulo X, Y, Z. And I think that's, so, no, I get it. Yeah. So I think that it would not be possible to classify people's psychological takes as, invested in truth, not invested in truth. That's not an axis that's useful. Yeah. So I think, are there any other questions from anyone else, or if not, I mean, I think we have a little bit more time. We have another, 10, 15 minutes, and we can continue along the sort of points. So Kevin, I wanted to hear from you what your assessment is of the sort of agent modeling approaches, because I mean, Jim kind of told us what he thinks about their limits, their advantages, and what is your kind of take of that kind of approach? Or do both of you, then the open question to both of you is, have you thought about what other kind of mathematical sort of quantitative approach might be useful? Framework.
Yeah, I can say it.
Yeah.
A bit on that. I mean, I think I'm broadly in agreement with a lot of things Jim says for many purposes. That the sort of how plausibly research program he was describing seems interesting and useful, and sometimes surprising, and maybe more importantly, tractable. I actually come at this from a slightly different angle. I come from a more analytic formal epistemology side of things, where we're using is much less computational based, much more proof based, much more detailed models of detailed rational models of individual agents. It's closer to the microeconomic equivalent. If this is macroeconomics, I'm doing microeconomics. And so coming from that background, the way I found these sort of computational models useful in a slightly different way, or from a slightly different angle perhaps than Jim does it. Now that I think about it, plausibly informs most of my questions, which is using the models to lift up those other techniques. So there are sometimes you have a model of how individual reasons, or how they update on evidence or whatnot, but it very quickly becomes intractable when you think of how they're going to do it over a long period of time, or with many other interacting agents. Not something you can write down proofs very easily about, at least except in very special cases. And so the one very useful thing for computational models is often you just simulate it and see what happens when an agent who acts in this way, which you've specified and argued makes sense or whatever, or at least accurately describes psychology in this sort of scenario. See how that will evolve over time. And this is the thing I mentioned earlier with Jim, where I, analytically had some hunch that it would go one way, and in fact, once you simulate it, goes a different way because there are multiple competing factors. So that's one way in which I feel like it can be useful. Not I wouldn't want to say certainly the only way, but as a way of lifting up either psychological or other motivated sort of microeconomic style models of individual reasoning, and seeing what the effects are when iterated or writ large. So that's a way that combines some different mathematical techniques with computational ones. I don't know if Jim wants. I also have a list of other questions I can pepper Jim with if we want to.
I mean, so I'm hearing Priya's question in part in the context of how to think about agent-based modeling in comparison with various simulation methods in other areas of science.
Yeah.
And so, even in the kind of example that Kevin just discussed, there are a few different things you might be thinking of doing with a simulation, right? So one is you just have some computationally intractable problem, and so you solve it numerically. And that's the sort of thing that we sometimes think of as a simulation in some areas of science. You might also think about, okay, so we can just leave it at that. There's sort of general slew of different computational techniques that you could bring to bear on problems. And there are sort of intermediate cases where it's not totally clear whether you should think of something as an agent-based model or not. The way I usually think about agent-based models is that you're thinking of them as a collection of individuals parameterized in some way that have some dynamical properties. Arguably cellular automata are agent-based models on that definition, but that's not how usually people think about them. And so, okay, so just what is it that makes sort of an agent-based model really an agent-based model? And I think you can very quickly come up with counterexamples to virtually any definition you could give, even though we have a pretty good general idea about how they work. But I mean, look, think about particle mesh type models in cosmology. There's a sense in which we're talking about particles, but it's also the case that we aren't representing particles, we're representing regions of phase space, and that they behave kind of like particles from one point of view.
Right.
And so, there's some sense in which this is a just a numerical method for solving certain complex differential equations, which themselves have an interpretation as governing small bodies acting in the collective. But
I mean, they're proxies. They are proxies with convenient properties for numerical manipulation, basically, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
No, because I wondered whether, I mean, I guess part of my question is whether, is there just an information flow approach that could be used? Could we just make maps of information flow and, intersections between those maps, collisions between those bits of information or whatever? I'm just trying to see if there are, if one were to model, what is it the transmission of that ends in polarization and so on? I'm just, freewheeling here, trying to see what kind of approach might be an interesting new way. Because, one of the goals of our longer term project is really to try and understand what are the ways in which we can depict complex processes from which we are able to pull out causation. We're going to infer causation from correlations and deeper correlations. How do we characterize complex systems in terms of the causal relations between entities that are part of the modeling scheme? So I was just curious, like in a meta way, is there a sort of another other approaches we could consider?
Yeah, I mean, Jim might know more on that. I feel like I sort of sometimes think of some of the agent-based models that Jim was describing as doing something like giving a map of information flow. How does information flow? Well, it flows from people saying and doing things. And so when we think of, and people are connected in certain ways via maybe networks of trust or communication or interaction, and then we can model that as, sort of like the two models Jim was using, the first two, the dynamics and the conformity.
So the network graphs kind of models, right? The network graphs kinds of models of
yeah.
You can think of there being a kind of a continuum here, maybe driven by computational tractability considerations, but where you go from very complicated networks and very simple rules for how information propagates on the network to very simple networks, maybe just a single agent or a small handful of agents, and complex psychologically realistic models of how those agents process information, which are themselves often network models, right? You have like a Bayesian network representing the single agent, right? But that you're sort of there are modeling frameworks that use very, very simple dynamics for how information propagates. So for instance, epidemiological models are often used in social epistemology, less so by philosophers, but often by psychologists, social psychologists, to study the flow of information. And what happens is basically, you have either some very complicated network or just random pairwise interactions, and there's some probability of some transmission. You can think of that as modeling information flow through a network or through some population.
Yeah. Kevin, we do have a few more minutes, so if you have any last points that you would want to discuss and bring up with Jim, please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, there was one, small questions I threw at Jim, which maybe I won't bore people with, but there's one question I had that it's related to what Jim was saying at the end of his talk, and maybe somewhat less related to some of this discussion. But insofar as he was worried about these, the initial worry for the three different models explaining polarization was, well, are they competing? Are they giving different explanations? And so does that mean they're in competition in some sense? One question I had when thinking through the models at first was, basically, to what extent we can see them all as arising from one root cause, which is trust in some sense. So like when we think about the conformity model in particular, like in many contexts, like what does a link represent in a context where, or when a model of these people is doing A or B and they're learning from some people and not others? Well, if we're thinking about a political case and like that, it better not just be lines of communication, because communication is cheap. Everyone can commute with everyone nowadays. It's got to be something more robust. And one natural thing is the lines of trust. They're the people that you listen to. And so like in this little model, the reason why there's no link between these two is not because this person can't see what this guy is shouting. It's just that this person doesn't trust that person. On that interpretation, then it looks like the conformity network models might have, you know, very similar motivation and very similar driving force underlying them to the trust dynamic ones. And likewise, you might even think with confirmation bias. Why is it that people tend to disregard information that they find is surprising? Well, a big reason is that they don't trust it. It's like when Breitbart comes out with a big news story about like what the Clintons were doing in, you know, mid 90s or whatever, I think, it's pretty questionable. I'm probably not going to listen to that because and the reasons I don't trust them as reporters. And so, I mean, maybe, you know, that's a unification without, there's potential to get unification in name without unification in substance. I mean, trust can have very different meanings in different contexts. But I was wondering if there's some deeper unity that could be had within these class of models, as in some sense trust drives.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are a lot of interesting things that one could say or think about more here. One remark is just there's an interpretation of the trust model that we presented where it's a dynamical network model. And really what's going on is we have either, everyone is connected to everyone, but the strength of connection moderates over time as a function of distance and belief. Or you could even think of it being a kind of a literal distance. You know, people are arranged on some grid and move in belief space over time and listen to others based on their actual distance in that space.
Do you all see the scary New York Times sort of thing, like mapping polarization within cities? Like within cities, you see these like massive red and blue sections, so on. This came out earlier this year. It's fascinating. Anyway. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so like literally space sometimes correlating with blue.
Right, but I mean, there's the like, what's the causal direction?
Oh yeah, it was
there, right? Yeah, but I mean, I think so. I think that there's something to that. Nonetheless, I also think that you don't need to think about the connections in the conformity model as representing trust. You can interpret them as, for instance, literal geographic, inaccessibility. Or, there's been a lot of theorizing about what happens on the internet, some of which has been debunked actually, but where, you have this idea of filter bubbles where there's literally, you see different content and it's very difficult to gain access to the other kind of content. And, that leads to an interpretation of the conformity model where it really is that you're not seeing everything that other people are putting out. You're right that it's not that you can't, in principle, overcome that, but it's sort of the first order, not what you're exposed to. And so I think it's interesting that even if you don't have, there may still be some underlying level at which trust is coming in, like, why is this the social network that you've built? Or why is this, why has your, what they call news diet or media diet shaped in the way that it is, that has to do on some other level with trust. But it turns out that just, differential exposure is sufficient, even if it's not trust-based. And so I think that that's an interesting upshot, even if there's some, other underlying explanation that makes this really more about trust than it's presented in the first instance.
Got it. Yeah, so it sounds like one could diffuse, even if one could diffuse the worry that these models are incompatible by saying, well, they all actually stem from the same thing. It's maybe not wise to, because the general point about, even if they did have different causes, even if we strictly interpret this as geographic location or whatever, then they could be, the point that they can be sufficient, not competing and interacting causes would be right. That's right. I mean, yeah.
We seem to be at a moment of natural pause. Let me quickly check if there any other questions have come up in the chat. I don't see anything. So I guess it's time to say thank you to both of you for a really nice, useful, clarifying, and fun discussion. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we had a solution to helping understand polarization? I think polarization is probably inevitable to some degree or the other. I guess it's part of human psychological, emotional, intellectual diversity that we may have to live with. But the kind of extreme levels of polarization have been so detrimental to society and culture, and in particular, the polarization around science and around facts and reason have been deeply disturbing in the last couple of decades. So I want to thank you both, Kevin and Jim, for this really wonderful afternoon. It's been a real privilege to listen to both of you discuss. And it's a treat that we were thankfully able to replicate in this virtual situation. And in many ways, I think while the pandemic has really thrown a number on many of our approaches to interacting and convening, one of the good things has been the reach and the possibility to get people without leaving a carbon footprint, well, not as big a carbon footprint, to convene and converse. So thank you both and bye to Irvine and in Pittsburgh. And have a wonderful weekend, a long weekend. Thanks, everyone. I want to thank the audience for attending and participating in this fabulous event. And I want to thank Ty for helping organize this and to Guy for helping with all the AV. So bye, everyone. Have a lovely
day. Thanks,
Bye,
Kevin.
everybody. Thank you.